South Korea's President Moon Jae-in meets with United States President Donald Trump at the White House. Security and trade were major issues on the agenda. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. When South Korea's President Moon visited Washington late last week for a meeting with U.S. President Trump, both leaders talked positively about the alliance between their countries. But they also discussed the pressing issue of security on the Korean peninsula, and they expressed concerns over the ongoing nuclear tests by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Trump issuing a new warning to the DPRK.
The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. Many years, and it's failed. And frankly, that patience is over.
President Moon, who was recently elected as South Korea's president, insisted he's anxious to find a resolution to the crisis and wants to see more progress.
To this end, our two leaders will employ both sanctions and dialogue in a phased and comprehensive approach. And based on this, we both pledged to seek a fundamental resolution of the North Korean nuclear problem.
Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now here in the studio is Yonho Kim. He's a senior researcher with the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University. With us from Seoul is Gregg Brazinsky. He is an associate professor of history and international studies at George Washington University. Joining us too from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Myung-Koo Kang. He is a professor at Baruch College, and he's an expert on DPRK-ROK relations. Also with us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International. Welcome to all of you to the show. Yonho, let me start with you here in the studio. So we have South Korea's new president meeting with President Trump. This meeting taking place at a time when there are increased tensions on the Korean peninsula. We also had that case of the U.S. student who died shortly after he was released from prison in the DPRK. So given all those conditions, how significant was this visit?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it was a very significant and meaningful meeting, especially, as you said, when we had the terrible and disastrous event, death of Warm Beer. And one of the most, to me personally, outstanding point of the joint statement was that the two countries, two leaders, agreed on the importance of human rights issues in North Korea. And in addition to that, Trump also supported Moon Jae-in's efforts to resume a dialogue with the North to deal with the humanitarian issues. So that's another big step forward. And also, Moon Jae-in, I think he successfully dismissed the popular Washington misperception of him as a progressive leader, to be willing to and ready to appease North Korea. That was not the message he tried to send. And Trump, I think he also supported that Moon Jae-in is ready to have a strong alliance with the United States. And that was confirmed at the summit meeting, I guess.
But he does want more engagement with the DPRK, doesn't he? Right.
But again, if you look at the joint statement carefully, the two leaders agreed on maximum pressure and engagement. So the leaders are, again, emphasizing the importance of keeping and maintaining and even strengthening sanctions against North Korea. But they did agree that sanctions is a tool of diplomacy. So they're not agreeing on sanctions for the sake of sanctions, but a tool that will lead North Korea to the negotiation table again.
Okay, let's go to Gregg in Seoul. Gregg, talking specifically about the nuclear and ballistic program of the DPRK, we heard there President Trump say that U.S. patience is over. The patience, of course, a reference to strategic patience, as it was called by the previous administration, the Obama administration. Given what the president is now saying, that our patience is worn thin, how do you see this unfolding?
Well, I think there's a variety of different ways that it can unfold. I mean, I think when he's talking about how strategic patience is coming to an end, it could mean several things. During the summit, what Trump actually said is that he would allow South Korea to take the lead a little bit in these negotiations. So it seemed to me that he was saying, well, if Moon Jae-in now wants to pursue negotiations and pursue engagement with North Korea, the United States might sit back a little bit and let that happen. But at the same time, I think Trump wants to keep all of his options on the table. He's not taking off more aggressive options, increased sanctions, increased pressure. I also think it's clear that he wants to differentiate himself from the previous administration. That's also an important goal of the president.
Myung, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, President Moon was elected on a platform of more engagement with the DPRK. Presumably that means he wants to talk more with the leadership in Pyongyang. What is his strategy, and do you think more talks are going to work? Is the U.S. going to go along with the idea of more talks?
I think the important message from this summit meeting, both governments agreed to regularize so-called 2+2 ministerial meetings. So foreign ministers and the defense ministers will have regular meetings. But at the same time, both leaders agreed high-level extended deterrence strategy and consultation group. So in other words, regularizing communication channels at the highest level between these two governments. So in terms of launching more engagement policies, to create some right circumstances in dealing with North Korea. But I think the South Korean Moon Jae-in government will quite closely collaborate and talk with the United States. I think that seems to be quite clearly agreed through this summit meeting.
But is it also your feeling, Myung, that the United States is going to allow South Korea to take the lead now?
Right. So especially humanitarian issues. So as Yonho has already pointed out, humanitarian is very critical. Those older people living in South Korea, they want to see their families, in the near future, and that they are pretty old. And other, humanitarian help, for those, North Korean people. So excluding, hard currency exchange between the two Koreas, but helping each other from a humanitarian perspective, that'll be the step-by-step, plan, which would be pursued by the Moon Jae-in government.
Qinduo, this must be of great interest to China. How is Beijing looking at this? I mean, the United States has been ratcheting up the pressure on China. Just in the last few days, we had Washington leveling new sanctions against a Chinese bank, and we also had the State Department approving the arms sales to Taiwan, those arms worth $1.4 billion. How is China seeing this?
Well, China sees, obviously, there's a recommitment, a reconfirmation of this military alliance between South Korea and the United States. And also, President Moon obviously has tried hard to identify himself with the position of Donald Trump in terms of the North Korea. And also the narrowed the difference, obviously, between engagement and also pressure against North Korea. But still, I see the slight difference. You see, President Moon still prefers more engagement, more conciliatory method toward North Korea, while President Trump talks more about sanctions, pressure, and even military options over there. But we don't know how far they can go. They agreed upon this. Any dialogue will be conditional on the nuclear freeze from North Korea. But that's the conditions. But whether that will be workable on the ground, it takes time to see.
Yonho, when we look at the relationship between the United States and South Korea, with the election of Moon Jae-in, has the relationship in any way changed, do you think?
I don't think so. I think at least at the beginning, before Moon Jae-in was elected, there was widespread concerns among the Korean people that the United States is not paying the attention to the South Korean people's concern that they deserve. They called it Korea passing, meaning the United States is dealing with Japan and China only, and try to ignore South Korea in dealing with the North Korea problem. But I think with the election of Moon Jae-in, that kind of concerns was addressed enough, and the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea has, I would say, restored to the normal situation.
What about military cooperation? I mean, take something like the THAAD anti-missile system that the United States wants to deploy in South Korea. The previous administration in Seoul welcomed that idea. The current president is not so keen on it.
Well, the previous administration, when it comes to their position on THAAD, it was not that consistent. At first, they maintained a very, I would say, murky or not that clear position for a strategic purpose. But in the last year of Park Geun-hye's administration, she just suddenly decided to deploy THAAD, which surprised many people, both within and outside South Korea. Moon Jae-in, obviously, he's a liberal politician and leaning toward more conservative, if you will, on the idea of deploying THAAD. But he and his foreign policy team members made it clear that South Korea is ready to and willing to deploy THAAD, and that is one of the main pillar of or main elements of maintaining the alliance with the United States. But the thing is, the new government, which was born on the candlelight revolution, as Moon Jae-in characterized it in Washington, they have to secure the democratic or political legitimacy of the THAAD deployment decision. That's what's going on in South Korea right now.
Okay, Greg, what is your feeling on this? The previous government in Seoul was very hardline. They took a very hardline attitude towards the DPRK. Now we have the new president talking about engagement, talking about more talks, and we know that talks have not worked. We had the six-party talks, and that's been frozen. So is there a big change here?
Well, I think the hardline approach didn't work very well either, if you look at it. You had 10 years of a hardline approach taken by Lee Myung-Pak and then Park Geun-hye, and what did it really accomplish? North Korea continued to develop its missile programs, continued to develop its nuclear weapons programs, and now North Korea is more isolated. I think if North Korea is more isolated, it's more dangerous. I think that's it's very important to recognize that. If you can make North Korea a little bit less isolated, open some lines of contact between Pyongyang and Seoul, or open more lines of contact between Pyongyang and Seoul, the danger of some sort of accident ballooning into a more catastrophic event is less. So I think the hardline approach didn't work very well. I think Kim Dae-jung actually during the late 1990s had some limited successes with the Sunshine Policy. I'm not saying that policy was perfect, but I think the overall situation on the Korean Peninsula was far less tense, far more peaceful, and there was far more progress in the late 1990s and early 2000s under Kim Dae-jung than there is now. Now, of course, the government in North Korea is different today than it is now. Kim Jong-un is more aggressive, more nationalistic than Kim Jong-il, but I still think there is definitely a logic behind trying some of the things that Moon Jae-in wants to try. Give Pyongyang a role in hosting the Winter Olympics. All of these are and in addition to the Olympics, some of the other engagement measures that Moon has advocated. I think there's a logic behind doing it. I don't think things can get that much worse than they are now. So it's, I think it's time to try something new.
Myung, if talks resume, if they resume under the banner of the six-party talks plan, or even if they resume as bilateral talks between South Korea and the DPRK, or trilateral talks involving the United States, what is it going to take for the DPRK to say, okay, we have a deal, we will dismantle our nuclear weapons, we will cease our ballistic tests?
That's a very tough question. Now, from a longer-term point of view, some multilateral, collective, talks would be helpful in lessening the current, tension going on around the Korean Peninsula. For instance, six-party talk, including, Russia, China, Japan, South and North Korea, and the United States. But another important thing is that diplomatic normalization between North Korea and Japan. That is also very important. Another thing is that we need to think about, long legacy of the Korean War. As you know well, truce is still, there's no peace regime has been established in concluding the Korean War yet. So the multilateral talks and then bilateral talks will be combined, but ultimately the regime's survival. I mean, the North Korean Kim Jong-un regime's motivation, fundamental motivation of developing nuclear weapons and then long-range missile tests, and then all these things basically is for regime's security, regime's survival. So as we know well, the collapse of the North Korean regime has been long held kind of hypothesis or assumed among many experts in dealing with North Korea. But as you know well, North Korean regime will not collapse quite soon. So guaranteeing some sort of, regime's survival, that'll be the precondition for some substantive, breakthrough through bilateral or multilateral talks.
Okay, we need to take a quick break right now. Much more on U.S. Republic of Korea relations when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.